She fled into a stranger's arms for safety, only to find he's a ruthless mafia boss with a deadly agenda. Trapped in his world of violence and power, can she resist the dangerous pull between survival and an undeniable attraction? Sophie's footsteps echoed off the brick buildings as she hurried down the empty street. The familiar route home from her studio felt different tonight, threatening. Her fingers clutched the strap of her worn leather bag tighter, her heart picking up speed with each block she covered. A noise behind her made her pause. She glanced over her shoulder, seeing only shadows dancing under the dim streetlights. But the prickling sensation on the back of her neck wouldn't go away. Someone was watching her. She quickened her pace, her boots clicking faster against the concrete. The sound bounced off the walls, mixing with what she swore were other footsteps. Her breathing grew shallow as panic started to creep in. "Just 2 more blocks," she whispered to herself. "You're being paranoid." The words had barely left her mouth when 2 figures stepped out of the alley ahead, blocking her path. Their faces were covered with black masks, and the metallic glint in one man's hand made her blood run cold. "Hand over the bag, sweetheart," the taller one said, his voice rough behind the mask. Sophie's throat went dry. "Please, I don't have anything valuable." Now, the second man took a step closer, and the knife in his hand caught the dim light. Her hands trembled as she gripped her bag tighter. All her supplies were in there. Brushes, sketches, her whole life's work. "I can't!" The man lunged forward, grabbing her arm. Sophie screamed, the sound piercing the quiet night air. Then everything happened at once. A massive shadow detached itself from the darkness. Sophie barely had time to register what was happening before the first attacker went flying backward, crashing into the brick wall with a sickening thud. The second man swung his knife, but the shadowy figure moved like water, catching his wrist and twisting until bones cracked. In seconds, both attackers lay motionless on the ground. Sophie stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs as her savior turned toward her. He was tall, impossibly so, with broad shoulders that blocked out the streetlight behind him. But it was his eyes that caught her, green and cold as winter frost, yet somehow burning with an intensity that made her take a step back. He stared at her for a long moment, his face a mask of controlled violence, before speaking in a voice that sent shivers down her spine. "You shouldn't be out here alone." Sophie's heart thundered against her ribs as she stared at the unconscious men sprawled across the wet pavement. Her breath came in short gasps, the metallic scent of blood mixing with the night air. The man who had saved her turned, his massive frame blocking out the dim streetlight. His green eyes locked onto hers, and something in them made her blood run cold. They weren't the eyes of a good Samaritan. They held too much darkness, too much controlled violence. "You're not safe here." His voice was deep, quiet, but carried an authority that made her shiver. Before she could protest, his hand wrapped around her upper arm. His grip was gentle but left no room for argument as he guided her away from the scene. Sophie stumbled along beside him, her mind spinning with questions she was too terrified to voice. A black SUV idled at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the streetlights like dark mirrors. The man opened the back door, and Sophie hesitated. Every instinct screamed that getting into a stranger's car was dangerous. But hadn't he just saved her life? "Please," he said, though it sounded more like a command than a request. Sophie slid into the leather seat, her hands trembling in her lap. The man got in beside her, and the SUV pulled away from the curb. The interior was silent except for her ragged breathing and the soft purr of the engine. She stole a glance at her savior, turned captor. His profile was sharp, dangerous, and his presence seemed to fill the entire space. Sophie pressed herself against the door, making herself as small as possible. She had so many questions, but fear kept them locked behind her teeth as they drove into the darkness of the city night. The heavy oak doors swung open, revealing a mansion that took Sophie's breath away. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, and priceless artwork adorned walls that stretched toward impossibly high ceilings. The place reeked of old money and danger. Her mysterious savior's footsteps echoed behind her as he guided her inside, his large hand still firmly gripping her elbow. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs as two suited men emerged from adjoining rooms, their faces hard and expressionless. "Boss," they both muttered with quick nods. "Boss?" Sophie's stomach dropped. The word confirmed what she'd feared since watching him dispatch those thieves with terrifying efficiency. This man wasn't just some good Samaritan. "Take her to the East Wing guest room," he commanded, his deep voice sending shivers down her spine. "Make sure she's comfortable." "I'm not staying here," Sophie protested, finding her voice at last. She tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. "I need to go home." He turned to face her then, and Sophie's words died in her throat. His green eyes bore into hers with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. "You're not safe out there," he said quietly. "Someone wants something from you, and until I figure out what that is, you're staying right here where I can protect you. You can't just keep me here against my will." The words came out shakier than she'd intended. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I just did." Later, lying in a bed that probably cost more than her entire apartment, Sophie stared up at the ornate ceiling. The sheets were silk, the mattress cloud soft, but sleep felt impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, dangerous and beautiful, like a predator's. Who was he? Why had he saved her? And why did the thought of him make her pulse race with something that wasn't entirely fear? In the quiet darkness of the strange room, Sophie wrapped her arms around herself, trying to make sense of how her ordinary life had suddenly turned into something out of a crime thriller. She was trapped in a mansion with a man who clearly commanded fear and respect, a man whose very presence made her feel both terrified and inexplicably drawn to him. As exhaustion finally began to take hold, one thought kept circling in her mind. She was now at the mercy of someone who was probably just as dangerous as the men he'd saved her from. Sunlight streamed through unfamiliar windows, casting long shadows across the luxurious bedroom. Sophie's eyes fluttered open, momentarily disoriented by the silk sheets and ornate furnishings surrounding her. For a split second, she forgot where she was, until heavy footsteps approached her door. A sharp knock echoed through the room, followed by the door swinging open. The man from last night filled the doorframe, his broad shoulders and commanding presence making the spacious room feel suddenly small. In the morning light, Sophie could finally see him clearly. Sharp jawline, intense green eyes, and an expression that gave nothing away. "I'm Vincenzo Romano," he said, his voice deep and controlled. "But you can call me Vince." Sophie sat up straighter, pulling the sheets closer to her chest, despite being fully dressed. "The man who saved me?" "Yes." He stepped into the room, and Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. "You're safe here, Miss Miller. My men will ensure your protection until this situation is resolved." "Protection?" Sophie's voice cracked. "I don't need protection. I need to go home." Vince's expression hardened. "The men who attacked you weren't random thieves. They were sent by someone who wants something from you. Leaving now would be unwise." Sophie pushed back the covers and stood, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "You can't keep me here. I have a life, a job, a life you won't have if you walk out that door." His words were soft, but carried the weight of steel. The choice is yours, but I strongly suggest you reconsider. Or what? Sophie challenged, even as fear coiled in her stomach. You'll force me to stay? Something dangerous flickered in Vince's eyes. I don't force women to do anything, Miss Miller, but I also don't let innocent people die when I can prevent it. The tension crackled between them like electricity. Sophie's hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists, refusing to show weakness. I want to leave. Now. Vince's jaw tightened. Then you're a fool. He turned toward the door, pausing in the threshold. Breakfast will be served in 30 minutes. Join me or don't. But remember, my protection only extends as far as these walls. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mansion's manicured lawn as Sophie made her desperate bid for freedom. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she walked quickly toward the iron gates, trying not to look suspicious. She'd waited until the guards changed shifts, timing it perfectly, or so she thought. Going somewhere, Miss Miller? The deep voice stopped her in her tracks. Two of Vince's men materialized from behind the hedges, their dark suits and stern expressions leaving no doubt about their intentions. Sophie's stomach dropped. I'm leaving, she said, proud that her voice didn't shake. You can't keep me here against my will. Actually, we can. The familiar cold voice sent shivers down her spine. Sophie turned to find Vince striding toward her, his green eyes hard as emeralds. Giovanni Salieri has put a price on your head, $200,000 to be exact. Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. What? Why? Would he? Your father's debts. Vince's words cut through the air like steel. Did you really think those men last night were ordinary thieves? Salieri's been hunting you for weeks. My father? Sophie's world tilted on its axis, but he's been gone for years and left you holding the bag. Vince moved closer, his presence overwhelming. You have two choices, Sophie. Stay here under my protection, or walk out those gates and see how long you last with Salieri's men hunting you. Anger flared in Sophie's chest, hot and bright. So I'm just supposed to trust you? The man who won't even let me call my family? Trust that I want you alive? His eyes locked with hers, intense and unblinking, which is more than Salieri can say. Sophie wrapped her arms around herself, feeling trapped and helpless. The weight of her situation crashed down on her shoulders. She was caught between two dangerous men, and her only shield was the very person who terrified her most. Fine, she whispered, hating the defeat in her voice. I'll stay. Vince's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Satisfaction, perhaps, or relief. He gestured toward the mansion. Smart choice. As Sophie walked back toward her gilded prison, she could feel Vince's presence behind her, solid and unmovable as a mountain. She might be safer here, but she'd never felt more trapped in her life. Sophie stood at the window of her luxurious prison, watching the sun set behind the mansion's iron gates. 5 days had passed since Vince had forced her to stay, and despite her determination to hate every minute, she found herself noticing things. Little things that didn't fit with the image of the ruthless mafia boss she'd first met, like how he made sure fresh coffee and pastries appeared outside her door every morning, or how his dark suits were always impeccable, but his hands bore the calluses of someone who'd fought his way up from nothing. A movement caught her eye. Vince paced. The garden below, phone pressed to his ear. Even from here, she could see the tension in his broad shoulders. Marco, listen to me. His deep voice carried through the evening air. Get the kid to Dr. Stevens. I don't care what time it is. There was a pause. Yes, I'll cover all the expenses. Make sure his mother has everything she needs. Sophie's breath caught. The tenderness in his tone was so different from his usual cold commands. She leaned closer to the window, drawn by this glimpse of humanity. "The boy's father died protecting our interests," Vince continued, running a hand through his dark hair. "We take care of our own." Something shifted in Sophie's chest. The man below wasn't just the monster who'd killed her attackers or the boss who'd imprisoned her. He was something more complicated, a protector, even if his methods were brutal. Vince ended the call and looked up suddenly, his green eyes finding her at the window. Sophie froze, caught in his gaze. For a moment, neither moved. Then his expression softened just slightly, and he gave her a small nod before turning away. Sophie pressed her hand against the cool glass, her heart beating faster than it should. This was dangerous. Not the threat of violence she'd first feared, but something else entirely. She was beginning to see the man behind the monster, and that terrified her more than any display of his power ever could. The dining room was as opulent as the rest of Vince's mansion, all dark wood and crystal chandeliers. Sophie pushed her food around her plate, stealing glances at the man sitting at the head of the long table. His jaw was tight, eyes distant as he stared at nothing in particular. The silence stretched between them like a rubber band ready to snap. Usually, Vince maintained perfect control, but tonight something was off. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air. "Why did you really save me that night?" Sophie finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vince's green eyes flickered to her face, then away again. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." She set down her fork. "I want to understand." His laugh was hollow. "There's nothing to understand. I saw someone in trouble. I helped." But the tension in his shoulders told a different story. "That's not true." Sophie leaned forward. "You don't do anything without a reason." Silence fell again, broken only by the soft clink of silverware. Just when she thought he wouldn't answer, Vince spoke, his voice low and rough. "I was 17 when my father was killed, betrayed by his best friend." His knuckles went white around his wine glass. "I learned then that trust is a weapon others use against you." Sophie's heart squeezed. "Is that why you built all this? To protect yourself? To protect what's mine?" His eyes met hers, intense and unblinking. "I fought my way up from nothing. Every person who tried to stop me ended up dead or wishing they were." A chill ran down Sophie's spine, but she didn't look away. "And now? Now I have an empire built on loyalty and fear." He took a slow sip of wine. "The only people close to me have proven themselves worthy of trust. And where do I fit in all this?" Vince's expression softened for just a moment. So briefly, Sophie wasn't sure she'd seen it at all. "You don't. That's what makes you dangerous." Sophie sat back, her appetite gone. She understood him better now. This man, shaped by violence and betrayal. But understanding didn't make her situation any less terrifying. She was still a bird in a gilded cage, trapped with a predator who might protect her or destroy her. As if reading her thoughts, Vince's expression hardened again. "You're safer here than anywhere else, Sophie, even if you don't believe it yet." She nodded slowly, but her heart was heavy, because despite the glimpse of vulnerability he'd shown her, she couldn't forget what he was. A man who'd built his empire on blood and bodies. A man who might just break her heart if she let him. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of Sophie's temporary studio, casting golden rays across the polished hardwood floor. Her heart skipped a beat when she noticed the package propped against her easel, a massive, carefully wrapped rectangle that could only be one thing. Her fingers trembled as she peeled back the brown paper, revealing an exquisite oil painting she'd only ever seen in art history books. It was a rare piece from a legendary contemporary artist, one she'd mentioned admiring during their tense dinner conversation days ago. "Do you like it?" Vince's deep voice came from behind her, making her jump. Sophie turned to face him, her emotions warring between gratitude and suspicion. He stood in the doorway, his imposing figure softened by the morning light, those green eyes watching her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. "I can't accept this," she whispered, though her artist's soul ached to keep it. "It must have cost. Money isn't an issue." He cut her off, taking a step closer. "You mentioned wanting to study his technique." The fact that he'd remembered such a small detail from their conversation made her chest tighten. It was easier when he was just the cold-hearted mafia boss who'd trapped her here. This thoughtfulness, this attention to her passions, it complicated everything. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely audible. "But why?" Vince's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his face. "Because you deserve beautiful things, Sophie, even in this ugly world." He left before she could respond, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Sophie sank onto her stool, staring at the masterpiece before her. Her fingers reached out to trace the frame, and she caught herself smiling despite her better judgment. The man who'd given her this gift was the same one who'd killed without hesitation that night in the alley. The same one who kept her here against her will. Yet, as she studied the painting, proof that he'd actually listened to her, actually cared about her interests, she felt her walls beginning to crack. How could someone so dangerous be capable of such a tender gesture? And why did that thought make her heart race with something other than fear? In Vince's dimly lit study, Sophie stood by the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The city lights twinkled below, but they offered no comfort tonight. Vince's presence behind her was like a physical weight, his power filling the room. "Your father's debts to Giovanni were just the beginning," Vince said, his voice low and controlled. "Salieri wants to use you to get to me." Sophie turned, meeting his piercing green eyes. "Why me? What could I possibly offer him? Your family's old connections. The artwork you restore." Vince moved closer, and Sophie caught the faint scent of his expensive cologne. "Giovanni needs to launder money, and your gallery would be the perfect cover." Her stomach dropped. "So I'm just a pawn in your mafia war?" "No." The word came out sharp, almost angry. Vince's jaw tightened. "You're under my protection now. That means something in our world." Sophie laughed bitterly. "Your world? I never asked to be part of your world, but you are now." Vince's expression softened slightly. "Giovanni won't stop. He'll use you, hurt you, destroy everything you've built. Unless I stay here, with you." The words tasted bitter in her mouth. Vince nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know you don't trust me, but right now, I'm your only option." Sophie turned back to the window, watching her reflection blur with tears. She was trapped, caught between two dangerous men in a game she never wanted to play. But what scared her most wasn't Giovanni's threats or even Vince's power. It was the way her heart raced whenever Vince stood close, the way his presence made her feel both terrified and safe. "I don't have a choice, do I?" she whispered. "There's always a choice, Sophie." Vince's voice was quiet, but sometimes survival means choosing the devil you know. The darkness of the city seemed to creep closer, wrapping around them both like a shroud. Sophie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her new reality settle over her. She was in Vince's world now, for better or worse, and there was no going back. Sophie traced her fingers along the ornate balustrade of the mansion's grand staircase, her steps slower and more deliberate than they had been days ago. The fear that had made her heart race whenever she heard Vince's footsteps was changing into something else, something that made her pulse quicken for entirely different reasons. She watched from above as Vince conducted business in the foyer below. His broad shoulders were straight, his stance commanding as he spoke with one of his men. But when he caught her eye, his expression softened for just a moment. A change so subtle that only someone who'd been studying him as closely as she had would notice. "Miss Miller," he called out, his deep voice echoing through the space. "Join us." It wasn't a request, but it wasn't quite the same cold command she'd grown used to either. Sophie descended the stairs, her bare feet silent against the marble steps. Vince's right-hand man excused himself with a respectful nod. "We're discussing security measures for the East Wing," Vince said, turning to face her fully. "I'd value your input considering you spend considerable time in the art studio there." Sophie blinked in surprise. "You want my opinion? You're observant." His green eyes held hers steadily. "And you're not afraid to speak your mind even to me." A week ago, those words would have terrified her. Now, they made her cheeks warm. "The windows," she said. "They're beautiful, but exposed. Anyone could..." "Already being handled." Vince stepped closer, and Sophie caught the scent of his cologne, expensive and masculine. "I protect what's mine." The possessiveness in his voice should have made her angry. Instead, it sent a shiver down her spine. She watched as his hand moved, almost touching her face, before dropping back to his side. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure if she was thanking him for the protection or for treating her like a person instead of a prisoner. Vince's jaw tightened, and something dark flashed in his eyes. "Don't thank me, Sophie. Not when I'm the reason you're in danger." But that wasn't entirely true anymore, was it? The danger was real, but so was the way he looked at her, the way he said her name, like it was something precious and dangerous. All at once, as Sophie turned to leave, she felt his gaze following her. The mansion no longer felt like a prison, it felt like something else. Something that scared her more than the cold steel of his gun or the blood on his hands. Because somehow, in the midst of all this darkness, she was starting to feel at home. And the most terrifying part was that she wasn't sure if she wanted to fight that feeling anymore. The scene captures Sophie's evolving feelings toward Vince while maintaining the dark romance elements and power dynamics central to their relationship. It shows their growing attraction while acknowledging the dangerous nature of their situation, staying true to both characters' established personalities and the overall tone of the story. I'll write this scene maintaining the dark, sensual tone while balancing violence with emotional complexity. The night wrapped around the mansion like a silk shroud, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She paced in her room, the expensive carpet muffling her footsteps. When the first gunshot shattered the silence, her heart stopped. More shots followed, accompanied by shouts and the sound of breaking glass. Sophie pressed herself against the wall, her breathing shallow and quick. The door burst open, and Vince filled the frame, his broad shoulders blocking the light from the hallway. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice ice cold. His green eyes swept over her, checking she was unharmed. "Lock the door." Before she could respond, he was gone. Sophie's trembling fingers turned the lock, and she backed away from the door. Through the walls, she heard the chaos unfolding, the unmistakable sounds of violence that made her stomach turn. Minutes stretched like hours. Then silence fell, heavy and thick. When Vince returned, his white shirt was spattered with red, but his face showed no emotion. He moved with the same deadly grace she'd witnessed the night he saved her, except now she understood what that grace meant. Death followed this man like a shadow. "Giovanni's men," he said simply, crossing the room to her. "They won't be a problem anymore." Sophie wrapped her arms around herself, unable to stop shaking. "Did you? Are they all dead?" Yes. His answer was quick, matter of fact. When he reached for her, she flinched. Something flickered in his eyes. Hurt, maybe, or frustration. This is my world, Sophie. I won't apologize for protecting what's mine. The word mine hung between them, heavy with meaning. Sophie felt tears burn her eyes as reality crashed down around her. This was her life now. Beautiful rooms and expensive gifts, but also violence and death. And Vince, dangerous, protective Vince, who killed without remorse but looked at her like she was something precious. "I can't do this," she whispered. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew it was too late. She was already caught in his web, trapped between fear and something else, something that made her heart race when he stepped closer. "You don't have a choice anymore," he said softly, his hand coming up to cup her face. His touch was gentle, such a stark contrast to the violence he'd just delivered. "You're in too deep now, Sophie. The only way out is through me." She knew he was right. There was no escape from this world now, no escape from him. The thought should have terrified her more than it did. Instead, she found herself leaning into his touch, even as her mind screamed at her to run. The night pressed in around them, and Sophie realized she was exactly where Giovanni wanted her, completely dependent on Vince's protection. But as she looked up into those green eyes, she wondered if maybe she'd been trapped long before tonight's violence. Trapped not by fear or circumstance, but by something far more dangerous, her growing feelings for the monster who'd saved her life. Sophie paced her room like a caged animal, her heart hammering against her ribs. The mansion's luxury felt more suffocating with each passing day. She glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. Perfect timing. Vince's men would be at their most relaxed now. She grabbed her pre-packed bag and crept toward the door, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet. The hallway stretched before her, dark and empty. Each step brought a mix of hope and dread. But she had to try, had to escape before she lost herself completely in this dangerous world. She made it halfway down the grand staircase when a shadow moved in the foyer. Her breath caught in her throat. "Going somewhere?" Vince's voice was soft, deadly calm. Sophie froze, her fingers tightening on the banister. He emerged from the darkness like a predator, his green eyes gleaming in the dim light. She'd never seen him look so intense. "So, final. I can't stay here," she whispered, but her voice trembled. Vince climbed the stairs slowly, deliberately, until he stood one step below her. Even there, he towered over her. "You still don't understand, do you?" His hand reached up, fingers trailing along her jaw. "You're mine now, Sophie, body and soul." She jerked away, anger flaring. "I don't belong to anyone." "No?" His smile was dark, knowing. "Then why does your heart race when I'm near? Why do you watch me when you think I'm not looking?" Heat rushed to her cheeks. She tried to step back, but his arm snaked around her waist, pulling her against his chest. His warmth seeped into her, familiar and dangerous. "Let me go," she demanded. But it sounded weak, even to her own ears. "Never." His voice roughened. "This world, my world, it's yours now too. Stop fighting it. Stop fighting us." Sophie's resistance crumbled like sand. She could feel tears burning behind her eyes as the truth hit her. She didn't want to leave, not really. What terrified her wasn't Vince, or even his violent world. It was how much she'd grown to need him, to want him. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Tell me you understand now," he murmured. She looked up into his eyes, saw the possession there, the need that matched her own. "I understand," she whispered, and felt something inside her shift. Accept. Surrender. She belonged to him. And the scariest part was, she didn't know if she could live any other way anymore. Following their intense confrontation, Vince led Sophie through the dimly lit corridors of his mansion. Her heart still raced, but not from fear anymore. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension as they entered his private study. A room she'd never been allowed in before. Dark wooden panels lined the walls, and a crystal decanter of amber liquid sat on an antique desk. Vince poured 2 glasses, his movements precise and controlled. When he turned to face her, his green eyes held an intensity that made her breath catch. "You need to understand what staying here means," he said, his voice low and rough. He handed her one of the glasses, his fingers brushing against hers. "This isn't a game, Sophie. My world doesn't allow for half measures." Sophie took a slow sip, the liquor burning her throat. "And what exactly are you offering, Vince?" He moved closer, his presence overwhelming her senses. "My protection, my loyalty." His jaw tightened. "Everything I am, even the parts of you that terrify me?" she whispered. "Especially those parts." He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I won't change who I am, Sophie, but I'll never let anything hurt you." She shivered at his touch, fighting the urge to lean into it. "I can't just blindly accept everything about your world. I need to know what I'm getting into. Knowing everything could put you in danger." His expression darkened. "I'm already in danger," she countered. "If you want my trust, my loyalty, I need yours in return. Complete transparency, Vince. That's my condition." He studied her for a long moment, conflict clear in his eyes. Finally, he gave a slight nod. "You're asking for something I've never given anyone." "I know." She met his gaze steadily, despite her racing heart. "Then yes," he said softly. "No more secrets between us." Sophie set down her glass, her decision made. She was choosing this, choosing him with all the darkness and danger that came with it. "Then I'll stay." The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, but his eyes remained intense. This wasn't just an agreement, it was a pact sealed in the shadows of his world, binding them together in ways Sophie was only beginning to understand. The warm glow of evening light filtered through the mansion's tall windows as Sophie sat across from Vince in his private study. The leather armchair enveloped her, making her feel small yet oddly comfortable. A glass of red wine sat untouched before her, its deep color matching the rich wooden panels that lined the walls. "Tell me about your art," Vince said, his voice softer than usual. He'd loosened his tie, and something about seeing him slightly undone made Sophie's heart skip. She traced the rim of her wine glass with her finger. "It's always been my escape. When things got tough at home, I'd lock myself in my room and paint for hours." "Tough how?" His green eyes fixed on her with that intense focus that made her feel like she was the only person in the world. Sophie took a small sip of wine, letting the warmth spread through her chest. "My father, he wasn't great with money. We were always one missed payment away from disaster." She gave a bitter laugh. "I guess some things never change." Vince leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Is that why you push yourself so hard?" "I have to prove I'm different," she whispered, "that I can make it on my own." The silence between them felt charged with understanding. Vince's expression softened, and Sophie caught a glimpse of the man beneath the cold exterior, someone who understood what it meant to fight against the shadows of the past. "Your paintings," he said slowly, "they show more than just talent. They show heart." The compliment caught her off guard. She looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm fooling myself," she admitted. "Trying to make beauty in a world that can be so ugly." Vince's hand moved across the space between them, his fingers brushing against hers on the armrest. The touch was gentle, barely there, but it sent electricity racing through her body. "Maybe," he said, his voice low and intimate, That's exactly why the world needs your art. Sophie couldn't look away from where their hands touched, her skin tingling from the contact. The wall she'd built between them was crumbling, brick by brick, and she wasn't sure she wanted to stop it anymore. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken words and growing desire. When Vince finally withdrew his hand, the loss of contact left her aching for more. She knew then, with startling clarity, that she was falling for him, this dangerous, complex man who could destroy her world or become her whole world. And that thought terrified her more than any threat Giovanni could make. Sophie watched from the doorway of Vince's study as his underboss left, the man's shoulders tense and head bowed. These meetings had become a nightly ritual she'd observed from a careful distance. Tonight was different, though. She could see it in the way Vince's jaw clenched, in how his fingers drummed against the rich mahogany of his desk. The silence stretched between them until Sophie stepped inside. "Everything okay?" Vince's green eyes flickered to her, sharp and assessing before softening slightly. "It's nothing." "Doesn't look like nothing." She moved closer, drawn by the rare crack in his armor. The lamplight cast shadows across his face, highlighting the exhaustion etched there. He let out a heavy breath. "Sometimes I wonder if any of them are truly loyal. Every shadow could hide a traitor." The admission surprised her. This wasn't the cold, controlled man she'd come to know. This was something raw and real. "That sounds lonely," she said softly. "It's necessary." His voice was rough. "Trust gets you killed in this world." Sophie moved closer still until she stood beside his chair. "Do you trust anyone?" Vince looked up at her, his gaze intense enough to steal her breath. "I'm starting to." The air between them crackled with tension. Before Sophie could think better of it, she reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek. Vince caught her wrist, his grip firm but gentle. In one fluid motion, he stood, towering over her. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs as he pulled her closer. Their breaths mingled for a heartbeat before his lips crashed into hers. The kiss was everything she'd tried to deny wanting, desperate and demanding, yet achingly tender. His hands tangled in her hair as she gripped his shirt, pulling him closer. The taste of him, mint and something darker, made her head spin. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Sophie's lips tingled, and her whole body felt electric. She stared up at him, seeing the same shocked desire in his eyes that she felt coursing through her veins. Everything had changed in that single kiss. There was no going back now. The metallic taste of fear filled Sophie's mouth as she watched Vince tower over the kneeling man in the warehouse. His presence was different here. Gone was the man who'd kissed her breathless just days ago. In his place stood someone else entirely, someone who made her blood run cold. "You thought you could steal from me?" Vince's voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried a deadly edge that made Sophie's skin crawl. "That you could feed information to Giovanni and I wouldn't find out?" The man on the floor whimpered, blood dripping from his split lip. "Please, boss, I can explain." "There's nothing to explain." Vince circled him slowly like a predator stalking its prey. His green eyes, usually so intense when they looked at Sophie, were now empty of all emotion. "You know the price of betrayal." Sophie pressed herself against the wall, wanting to look away but finding herself unable to. She shouldn't have followed him here, shouldn't have let her curiosity get the better of her when she heard the commotion. Now she was witnessing something she could never unsee. The crack of gunfire echoed through the warehouse. One shot, clean and precise. The man crumpled to the floor. "Clean this up," Vince ordered his men, his voice as casual as if he'd just asked them to take out the trash. When he turned and saw Sophie, something flickered across his face, regret perhaps or concern. He crossed the distance between them in long strides. "You shouldn't be here." Sophie's voice cracked. I needed to understand. This is who I am, Sophie. His hand came up to cup her cheek, but she flinched away. The hurt that flashed in his eyes was gone so quickly she almost missed it. The world I live in requires violence. It's the only language some people understand. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop shaking. And what about the man who held me last night? Who kissed me like I was something precious? He's the same man. Vince's jaw tightened. I won't apologize for protecting what's mine, but I'll give you space to process this. Sophie fled to her room, her mind replaying the scene over and over. The gentle way he touched her face, even with blood on his hands. The tenderness in his voice. Moments after ending a life. How could such opposites exist in one person? She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing sleep wouldn't come. The worst part wasn't the violence she'd witnessed. It was realizing that despite everything, her heart still raced when she thought of him. She was falling for a monster, and she wasn't sure she could stop. In the darkness, Sophie heard his footsteps pause outside her door. For a moment, she thought he might come in, but the steps moved away, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the terrifying reality of who and what she was falling in love with. The mansion felt different at night. Sophie wandered the dark hallways, unable to sleep, her bare feet silent against the cold marble floors. She found Vince in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out the floor to ceiling windows at the city lights below. He didn't turn when she entered, but his shoulders tensed. You should be sleeping. So should you. Sophie moved closer, drawn to the raw energy that always surrounded him. Tonight, something was different. The usual steel in his posture had softened, replaced by something heavier, more painful. Bad memories, he said, his voice rough. They come at night. Sophie's heart squeezed. She'd never seen him like this, vulnerable, almost human. Do you want to talk about it? Vince turned then, his green eyes darker than usual. You don't want to hear about my demons, Sophie. Try me. He studied her for a long moment, then downed the rest of his whiskey. I was 18 when they killed my family. His words came out clipped, each one seeming to cost him something. My father's enemies. They came at night, just like this. Sophie's breath caught. She wanted to reach for him but held back, sensing he needed space to let the words out. I wasn't home, he continued, his knuckles white around the empty glass. I was out with friends, being stupid young when I got back. He shook his head. The house was burning. My mother, my little sister. His voice cracked, and Sophie felt tears spring to her eyes. Without thinking, she stepped forward and placed her hand on his arm. His muscles were rigid under her touch, but he didn't pull away. That's why you built all this? She whispered, understanding flooding through her. The power, the control. Everything I do is to make sure nothing like that ever happens again. He turned to face her fully, and the raw pain in his eyes took her breath away. To anyone He stopped, swallowing hard. Anyone you care about? Sophie finished softly. Vince's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle for someone so dangerous. Trust is a weapon in my world, Sophie. The moment you trust someone is the moment they can destroy you. She leaned into his touch, her heart racing. Is that why you keep everyone at arm's length? Yes. His thumb traced her bottom lip. Until you. Sophie's pulse jumped. Do you trust me? Against my better judgment. His eyes searched hers. The question is, do you trust me? Sophie thought about everything she'd seen, his violence, his power, but also his protection, his hidden tenderness. The man beneath the monster was showing himself to her, piece by broken piece. "Yes," she whispered. "I trust you." Something shifted in Vince's expression, a wall crumbling. He pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers. They stood there in the darkness, two broken people finding solace in each other's pain, while the city lights twinkled below like fallen stars. The heavy oak doors of Vince's study burst open. Two of his men dragged in Marco, his right-hand man for the past 5 years. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she watched from her place near the window, where she'd been reading before the commotion started. Vince sat behind his massive desk, his face a mask of cold fury. His green eyes, usually warming when they fell on Sophie, now held a darkness that made her shiver. "So it was you," Vince said, his voice deadly quiet. "All this time?" Marco struggled against the men holding him. "Boss, I can explain." "Explain what?" Vince stood slowly, his movements precise and controlled. "How you've been feeding information to Giovanni. How you put Sophie's life at risk." Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. The tension in the room was suffocating. "They threatened my family," Marco pleaded, sweat beading on his forehead. "I had no choice." "There's always a choice." Vince moved around his desk. "You could have come to me. I protect my own, Marco. You knew that." Sophie watched as Vince pulled out his gun, the metal gleaming in the dim light. Her fingers gripped the armrest of her chair until her knuckles turned white. "Please, boss." The gunshot rang out before Marco could finish his plea. Sophie jumped, a small gasp escaping her lips. Marco's body crumpled to the floor, and the two men holding him stepped back. "Clean this up," Vince ordered, his voice eerily calm. The men nodded and dragged Marco's body away. When they were alone, Sophie found her voice. "How? How many more traitors are there?" Vince turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "That's the thing about this world, Sophie. You never know who to trust." She stood on shaky legs. "And the danger? How bad is it, really?" He moved closer, his tall frame towering over her. "Giovanni won't stop until he has what he wants. And now that you're with me." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "There's no going back, not for either of us." Sophie felt the weight of his words settle over her like a heavy blanket. She was in too deep now, bound to this dangerous man and his violent world. The scariest part wasn't the danger itself. It was how much she'd grown to need him, despite everything she'd just witnessed. "So, this is it?" she whispered. "This is my life now?" "This is our life," he corrected, his hand cupping her cheek. "And I'll kill anyone who tries to take you from me." The promise in his words should have terrified her. Instead, she leaned into his touch, accepting the darkness that came with loving Vincenzo Romano. Sophie watched from the balcony as Vince's men patrolled the grounds below, their dark figures moving with practiced precision through the mansion's gardens. After 2 weeks under his protection, she was starting to recognize their patterns, the way they communicated with subtle hand signals. The respect they showed when Vince appeared, the sound of footsteps behind her made her spine tingle. She didn't need to turn around to know it was him. His presence filled any space he occupied. "You shouldn't stand so close to the edge," Vince said, his voice low and controlled. "You're too exposed here." Sophie turned to face him, her heart skipping at the sight of his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. "I can't hide inside forever." His green eyes darkened as he stepped closer. "You're not hiding. You're surviving." The way he moved toward her, like a predator stalking its prey, should have frightened her. Instead, it sent a shiver of anticipation down her spine. She'd watched him all week, the way he commanded his men, how he handled business calls with ruthless efficiency, the gentle way he asked about her comfort despite his cold exterior. Later that evening, over a dinner of perfectly cooked steaks and red wine, Sophie found herself studying his face in the warm lighting of the dining room. The scar above his eyebrow, the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers wrapped around the stem of his wine glass, everything about him screamed danger, yet she felt safer with him than she had in weeks. "Your men," she said carefully. "They'd die for you, wouldn't they?" Vince set down his glass, his eyes meeting hers. "They know I'd do the same for them." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "For anyone under my protection." The weight of his words hung between them. Sophie's breath caught as he stood, moving around the table until he was beside her chair. His hand came to rest on her shoulder, the heat of his palm burning through the thin fabric of her dress. "Giovanni's men were spotted near the city limits today," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He leaned down, his lips close to her ear. "But I want you to understand something, Sophie. No one, not Giovanni, not anyone, will ever hurt you. You're mine to protect now." Her heart hammered against her ribs. The possessiveness in his voice should have made her want to run. But instead, she found herself leaning into his touch. His other hand came up to cup her face, turning it toward him. "Do you understand?" he asked, his thumb brushing across her bottom lip. Sophie nodded, unable to find her voice. The lines between captivity and choice were blurring more each day, and she wasn't sure she wanted to find them again. "Good," he breathed, pulling back slightly but keeping his hand on her face. "Because in this world, Sophie, you need someone willing to burn it all down to keep you safe, and I will burn everything." His words sent a rush of heat through her body. She knew she was falling into his world, falling under his spell, falling for the monster everyone feared. And the scariest part was, she didn't want to stop. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Vince's sprawling estate as Sophie walked beside him through the manicured gardens. For once, his phone stayed silent in his pocket. No urgent calls about territory disputes. No whispered reports of enemy movements. Just the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze and their footsteps on the stone path. Sophie stole glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. Without the weight of his empire pressing down on his shoulders, Vince seemed almost normal. His usual razor-sharp focus had softened, and his jaw wasn't clenched in that permanent state of tension she'd grown used to seeing. "Tell me about your art," he said suddenly, his deep voice, gentle in a way that made her heart skip. "What inspires you?" The question caught her off guard. It was so ordinary, so far removed from their usual conversations about safety protocols and rival families. "Light and shadow," she answered, watching how the sunlight played across his strong features. The way they danced together, neither one existing without the other. "Just like us?" she thought, but didn't say. Vince's hand brushed against hers as they walked, and Sophie felt that familiar spark of electricity between them. He didn't pull away this time, instead letting his fingers intertwine with hers. His touch was warm, almost tender, so different from the hands that had dealt death just days ago. "I never had time for beautiful things," he admitted quietly. "Beauty was a luxury I couldn't afford." Sophie's heart ached at the sadness in his voice. And now, his green eyes met hers, intense and unguarded. "Now I'm beginning to see their value." They stopped at the edge of a small pond, where water lilies floated peacefully on the surface. Vince pulled her close, his strong arms wrapping around her from behind. Sophie leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. This was dangerous. Not the kind of danger that came with guns and rival mafia bosses, but the sort that threatened to break down every wall she'd built around her heart. In this perfect moment, she could almost forget who he was, what he did. But as the sun began to set, casting blood-red streaks across the sky, reality crept back in. Sophie felt Vince tense slightly, his arms tightening around her protectively. She knew this peaceful afternoon was just a brief respite, a calm before an inevitable storm. "Something's coming, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the evening breeze. Vince's silence was answer enough. He pressed his lips to her temple, and Sophie closed her eyes, trying to memorize everything about this moment. The warmth of his embrace, the scent of his cologne, the false sense of safety she felt in his arms, because deep in her heart, she knew their peace wouldn't last. It never did in Vince's world. The envelope arrived just before sunset, pristine white against the dark mahogany of Vince's desk. Sophie watched his face as he read the message inside, her stomach turning at the way his jaw tightened. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vince's green eyes met hers, cold and focused. "Giovanni's making his move." He crumpled the paper in his fist. "He's given us 24 hours to surrender you, or he'll start taking out my men one by one." Sophie's legs went weak. She grabbed the edge of his desk to steady herself. "This is my fault. If I hadn't—" "Stop." Vince's voice cut through her guilt like a knife. He stood, his massive frame casting a shadow over her. "None of this is your fault. Giovanni's been looking for an excuse to start a war. You're just convenient timing." Through the office windows, Sophie watched as Vince's men gathered in the courtyard below, checking weapons and speaking in hushed tones. The sight made everything feel terrifyingly real. "I'm scared," she admitted, hating how small her voice sounded. Vince moved behind her, his chest pressed against her back, his arms coming around to cage her in. The heat of him seeped into her bones, making her feel safer despite everything. "Listen to me carefully," he growled, his lips close to her ear. "I've killed for less than what Giovanni's threatening. He thinks you're my weakness, but he's wrong. You make me stronger. And I swear on my life, Sophie," his arms tightened around her, "I won't let him touch you." Sophie turned in his embrace, looking up at the man who'd become her protector, her captor, and something much more dangerous to her heart. His eyes burned with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I don't want anyone to die because of me," she whispered. "People die in my world every day," he said, his thumb brushing her cheek. "But I promise you this, I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe, even if it means burning this whole city to the ground." The scary part was, Sophie believed him. And what scared her even more was how safe that made her feel, knowing this dangerous man would unleash hell itself to protect her. She leaned into his touch, choosing him, choosing this, choosing all of it. "I trust you," she said softly. His eyes darkened at her words, and Sophie felt the shift between them, something final and unbreakable falling into place. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The night exploded into chaos without warning. Sophie jolted awake to the sound of shattering glass and gunfire. Before she could process what was happening, Vince burst into her room, his face a mask of cold fury. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by tactical gear, a gun already in his hand. "Stay here," he ordered, pushing her into the mansion's panic room. His green eyes blazed with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Don't open this door for anyone but me." The heavy steel door sealed shut with a hiss, leaving Sophie alone in the fortified space. Through the security monitors, she watched the nightmare unfold. Giovanni's men had breached the perimeter, dozens of black-clad figures swarming across the mansion grounds. But Vince was ready for them. He moved like a demon through his home, each shot precise and lethal. His men followed his lead, defending their territory with practiced efficiency. Sophie's hands trembled as she watched him work, equal parts terrified and mesmerized by his lethal grace. An explosion rocked the foundation. Sophie grabbed the desk to steady herself, her heart hammering against her ribs. On the monitors, she saw smoke billowing from the east wing. Through the chaos, she spotted Vince. Blood splattered across his face as he took down 3 of Giovanni's men in quick succession. This was his true nature, the beast beneath the businessman's facade. The violence should have repulsed her. But instead, she found herself praying for his safety, her fingers pressed against the cold screen. The firefight lasted 20 brutal minutes. When the door finally opened, Vince stood there, covered in blood and gunpowder. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms, his grip almost painful in its intensity. "You're mine now," he growled against her hair, his heart pounding against her cheek. "No going back, no running away. You understand?" Sophie nodded, clinging to him despite the blood and gore. She knew she should be horrified by what she'd witnessed, but all she felt was relief that he was alive. "I understand," she whispered, and felt him shudder against her. The mansion was in ruins around them, but Sophie knew the truth. She'd crossed a line tonight. She was part of his world now, bound to this dangerous man by something stronger than fear. The mansion felt different in the quiet aftermath of the attack. Shadows stretched longer across the marble floors, and even the air seemed heavier with the weight of what had happened. Sophie sat in Vince's private study, her fingers tracing the rim of a crystal glass filled with amber liquid she hadn't touched. Her hands still trembled when she thought about the gunfire, the shouting, the terrible sounds of violence that had echoed through the halls just hours ago. But what scared her more was how quickly she'd gotten used to it all. The danger, the violence, and most of all, the way her heart raced whenever Vince was near. "You're thinking too hard." Vince's deep voice cut through her thoughts. He stood by the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the fading light. Even now, after everything, he looked dangerous and beautiful, like a predator at rest. "How can I not?" Sophie's voice came out softer than she intended. "Everything's changed. I've changed." Vince moved toward her with that fluid grace that marked him as lethal. He knelt before her chair, and Sophie's breath caught as his calloused fingers tilted her chin up. His green eyes searched her face, intense and unblinking. "You're safe here," he said, his thumb brushing her lower lip. "With me." Sophie closed her eyes, overwhelmed by his closeness. "That's what scares me. I believe you. I believe in you." She opened her eyes again, meeting his gaze. "When did that happen?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "The moment you stopped running." He pulled her into his arms, and Sophie went willingly, breathing in his scent of expensive cologne and gunpowder. His heartbeat was steady against her cheek, a rhythm that had become as familiar as her own. "You're mine now," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough with possession. "Nothing will change that. Not Giovanni, not anyone." Sophie nodded against his chest, knowing it was true. She'd crossed a line somewhere between fear and fascination, between resistance and surrender. There was no going back to who she was before the girl who lived in a world of light and color, who thought she understood what darkness meant. Now, she knew better. She knew what real darkness looked like, and she knew what it meant to find light within it. That light was Vince, dangerous and intense, but hers all the same. The sun had almost set now, casting the room in deep shadows. But for the first time since this all began, Sophie wasn't afraid of the dark. She was becoming part of it. And somehow, in Vince's arms, that felt right. The evening cast long shadows through the mansion's windows as Sophie stood in Vince's study, watching him work at his desk. The warm glow of the lamp highlighted the sharp angles of his face, making him look both beautiful and dangerous. Her heart skipped a beat when he finally looked up at her. "You're staring," he said, his voice low and rough. "I'm thinking," Sophie replied, wrapping her arms around herself, "about everything that's happened, about us." Vince set down his pen and leaned back in his leather chair. His green eyes studied her with an intensity that made her shiver. Having second thoughts? No. The answer came quickly, surprising even her. "That's what scares me. I should want to run, but I don't." He stood up slowly, his movements graceful despite his imposing size. As he approached her, Sophie felt the familiar pull of his presence, like gravity drawing her in. "This isn't the life you wanted," he said, stopping inches from her. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing over her skin. "But it's the only one I can give you." Sophie leaned into his touch. "I know what you are now, Vince. I've seen the violence, the darkness, but I've also seen how you protect what's yours." She took a shaky breath. "And I am yours, aren't I?" His eyes darkened. "Since the moment I saw you on that street. Everything I've done since then has been to keep you safe. Giovanni won't stop coming for us," she whispered. "No, he won't." Vince's voice hardened. "But I'll burn his entire empire to the ground before I let him touch you." Sophie reached up, placing her hand over his where it rested on her cheek. "I used to think I was your prisoner, but that's not true anymore, is it? This isn't about keeping me captive. It's about keeping me close. You're the only person who's ever seen past the monster, Sophie." His words were rough with emotion. "I can't lose that. I can't lose you." She stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. "Then don't. I'm not running anymore, Vince. Whatever war is coming, whatever darkness we have to face, I'm choosing to face it with you." His arms wrapped around her, pulling her against his chest. She could feel his heart, beating, strong and steady. "I'll destroy anyone who tries to take you from me," he promised, his voice a dangerous whisper. "That's not a threat. It's a promise." "I know," Sophie said softly. And for the first time, the violence in his words didn't frighten her. Instead, it made her feel protected, cherished. "And I'll stand beside you while you do it." Vince pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, searching for any hint of doubt. Finding none, he pressed his forehead to hers. "Then you're ready for what comes next?" Sophie nodded, her decision made. She wasn't just a woman caught in his world anymore. She was choosing to be part of it, part of him. "Yes, whatever comes, we face it together." Heat crackled through the mansion like static before a storm. Sophie felt it everywhere, in the way Vince's men watched her with renewed intensity, in the charged silence of shared meals, in every brush of Vince's hand against hers as they moved through his study. He kept her close now, too close. The scent of his cologne mixed with leather and gunmetal filled her senses whenever he was near, which was constantly. His protective shadow loomed over her, suffocating yet oddly comforting. "Stay where I can see you," he'd growl whenever she drifted too far, his green eyes sharp with warning. Tonight, the tension peaked during a meeting with his top lieutenants. Sophie sat in the corner of his office, pretending to sketch while they discussed Giovanni's latest movements. But her pencil kept stopping as she found herself drawn to Vince's commanding presence. His voice was steel wrapped in velvet as he gave orders. "Double the patrols. No one gets within a mile of this place without my knowledge." The men filed out, leaving them alone in the dimly lit room. Sophie's heart hammered as Vince's footsteps drew closer. When she looked up, his eyes burned into hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "You shouldn't have to live like this," he said softly, his usual coldness cracking I don't have much choice, do I? Her voice came out shakier than intended. In 2 strides, he crossed the space between them. His hands gripped her arms, pulling her to her feet. Before she could protest, his mouth crashed against hers. The kiss was everything she'd feared and craved, brutal, yet tender, demanding yet giving. His fingers tangled in her hair as he pulled her closer, and Sophie found herself melting into him, her resistance crumbling like sand. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Sophie knew there was no more denying the truth. She wanted him, all of him, the darkness, the danger, everything she'd been fighting against. "Tell me to stop," he whispered against her lips, his voice rough with need. But Sophie wouldn't. The words died in her throat as she pulled him back down for another kiss, surrendering to the inevitable. Following Sophie's newfound acceptance of her feelings for Vince, the tension in the mansion reached a breaking point. Late one evening, Sophie found Vince in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out the window with haunted eyes. "They all leave in the end," he said without turning around. His voice was rough, weighed down by memories. "My father, my brother, everyone I've ever trusted." Sophie stepped closer, drawn to the vulnerability in his tone. The study was dark except for a single lamp, casting shadows across Vince's sharp features. "Is that why you keep everyone at arm's length?" she asked softly. He turned then, his green eyes intense. "In my world, trust gets you killed. Loyalty is everything." His fingers tightened around the glass. "One wrong move, one misplaced bit of faith, and everything I've built crumbles." Sophie's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "Not everyone will betray you, Vince, won't they?" He moved closer, his presence overwhelming. "You don't understand what I've had to do to keep this empire standing. The blood on my hands, the lives I've taken. I've seen what you're capable of." Sophie shot back, her temper flaring. "I'm not naive." "No?" Vince's voice turned dangerous. "You think you understand this world? The constant threat? The weight of knowing one mistake could mean death for everyone you care about?" Sophie stepped back, but Vince caught her arm, pulling her closer. His touch was gentle despite his harsh words. "You don't trust me," she accused. Something broke in Vince's expression. "I trust you too much," he growled. "That's what terrifies me. You've become my weakness, Sophie. The one thing my enemies could use against me." His admission hung heavy in the air between them. Sophie's breath caught as she saw the raw fear in his eyes, not fear of death or betrayal, but fear of losing her. "I won't be your weakness," she whispered. "Let me be your strength instead." Vince's hand moved to cup her face, his touch surprisingly tender. But the darkness never left his eyes, reminding Sophie that no matter how much he cared for her, he would always be a man shaped by violence and power. He pulled away abruptly, leaving Sophie cold. "Get some rest," he ordered, his walls slamming back into place. "Tomorrow won't be easy." Sophie left the study, her heart heavy. She was falling for a man who lived in shadows, and she wasn't sure if their love would be enough to overcome the darkness that surrounded them both. The moon cast long shadows across Vince's private garden as he led Sophie through winding paths lined with carefully tended roses. His hand rested on the small of her back, gentle but firm, a touch that had become familiar over the past weeks. They settled on a stone bench, tucked away behind tall hedges. The night air was heavy, with the scent of flowers and unspoken words. Sophie watched as Vince's shoulders slumped, his usual rigid posture melting away like ice in summer heat. "My father died here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Right there, under that oak tree. He pointed to an ancient tree whose branches stretched toward the stars. It wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. They made me watch. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She'd never seen him like this, stripped of his armor, vulnerable as a fresh wound. "I was 17, he continued, his green eyes distant. "My mother was already gone. Cancer. But my sister..." His jaw clenched. "Maria. She was only 12 when they took her. I never found her body." "Vince," Sophie whispered, her heart breaking for the boy he'd been. "I built all of this," he gestured to the mansion behind them, "because I swore no one would ever hurt the people I care about again." His laugh was bitter, hollow. "But look where it's gotten me. Everyone I let close either dies or betrays me." Sophie watched his hands tremble slightly before he clenched them into fists. This was Vince without his walls, without his carefully constructed facade of control. This was the man beneath the monster, scarred and bleeding from wounds that had never truly healed. "You don't have to be alone anymore," she said softly. His head snapped up, those piercing eyes finding hers in the darkness. "Don't," he warned, but his voice cracked. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Sophie." Slowly, carefully, she reached out and placed her hand over his heart. Through his expensive shirt, she felt its steady beat, the rhythm of a survivor. Vince went completely still, like a predator caught off guard. But he didn't pull away. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. In the distance, a car door slammed, reminding them of the dangers that lurked beyond this sanctuary. Vince's hand covered hers, pressing it harder against his chest. "I can't lose you too," he admitted, the words seemingly torn from his throat. "But this life I've built, it's a curse. Everything I touch turns to ash." Sophie leaned closer, drawn to his pain like a moth to flame. "Maybe," she whispered, "some things are worth the risk of burning." His other hand cupped her face, thumb tracing her cheekbone with surprising tenderness. But before he could respond, footsteps approached on the gravel path. Reality crashed back in, and Vince's walls slammed up once more. Yet as he pulled away, Sophie caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, a flicker of hope, quickly buried beneath layers of necessary darkness. They both knew this moment of vulnerability wouldn't last. Tomorrow, he would be the ruthless mafia boss again, and she would be the woman caught in his dangerous world. But for now, in this garden of shadows and secrets, they had shared something real, something that neither Giovanni's threats nor Vince's past could take away. The mansion hummed with tension as Sophie followed Vince down the marble hallway. His men lined the walls, heads bowed, shoulders stiff. Something was wrong, she could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating. Vince's jaw clenched as he entered his office, his green eyes dark with barely contained rage. "Someone's been talking to Giovanni," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Every move we've made, he's known about it." Sophie's heart dropped. She'd seen the signs the way Giovanni's men always seemed one step ahead, how they'd nearly cornered them twice last week. But a traitor? Here? "Boss," Marco, Vince's right-hand man, stepped forward. "We'll find who did this." Vince's laugh was cold, empty. "Oh, I know we will." His gaze swept across the room, landing on each of his men. "And when we do, they'll wish they'd never been born." Sophie shivered. This was the side of Vince that still terrified her, the ruthless mafia boss who'd built his empire on blood and fear. But now, that fear had crept inside his own walls. "Sophie." His voice softened when he turned to her. "Pack a bag. We're moving you somewhere safer." "Where?" she asked, but his expression told her not to push for details. As night fell, They left the mansion in a black SUV. Sophie sat close to Vince, drawing comfort from his warmth, despite her growing unease. The city lights blurred past as they wound through empty streets. Then it happened. The first bullet shattered their back window. Sophie screamed as Vince threw himself over her, shielding her body with his own. The car swerved violently. "Hold on!" the driver shouted. But more shots rang out. Vince's arms tightened around Sophie as the SUV spun out of control. Through the chaos, she caught glimpses of black vehicles closing in Giovanni's men. "They knew," Vince growled, his voice thick with fury. "They knew exactly where we'd be." The betrayal hung heavy in the air as they crashed into a guardrail. Sophie clung to Vince, her heart pounding against his chest. In that moment, surrounded by danger and darkness, she realized the true cost of trust in Vince's world. Someone close to them, someone they'd trusted, had sold them out. And as Giovanni's men closed in, Sophie wondered if she'd been wrong to trust anyone at all. Sophie's hands trembled as she paced the safe house floor. The smell of gunpowder still clung to her clothes, and her ears rang from the earlier gunfight. Blood stained the sleeve of her blouse, not hers, but a reminder of how close they'd come to death. Vince stood by the window, his broad shoulders tense as he scanned the darkened street below. Even now, after everything, he remained vigilant. Always the protector, always the predator. "I can't do this anymore," Sophie whispered, her voice cracking. The constant violence, the blood, the fear. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop shaking. Vince turned to face her, his green eyes dark with something that looked like pain. "There is no anymore, Sophie. This is what it is. But there has to be a way out." Her voice rose with desperation. "We could leave, disappear somewhere." "No." The word cut through the air like a blade. Vince crossed the room in 3 long strides, closing the distance between them. "Giovanni won't stop. He'll hunt us to the ends of the earth." Sophie felt the tears threatening to fall. "Why? Why won't he just leave us alone?" Vince's jaw clenched. For a moment, he looked away, and Sophie saw the weight of everything pressing down on his shoulders. When he spoke again, his voice was low, heavy with truth. "Because you're my weakness, Sophie. Giovanni knows it. He's using you to get to me, to bring down everything I've built." His hands came up to cup her face, rough palms against her tear-stained cheeks. "He won't stop until he destroys me completely. And the easiest way to do that is through you." The revelation hit Sophie like a physical blow. She stared up at Vince, seeing past his hardened exterior to the vulnerability beneath. This dangerous man, this killer, was laying himself bare before her. "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We survive." His thumbs brushed away her tears. "Together. But you need to understand, there's no halfway. You're either in this completely, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Sophie closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his hands on her face, the solid presence of him before her. She thought of all the blood, all the violence, all the darkness that surrounded him. But she also thought of his protection, his fierce loyalty, the tender moments when his guard dropped just for her. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good." His voice softened. "Fear keeps you alive. But I promise you this, as long as I'm breathing, nothing will happen to you." When Sophie opened her eyes again, she saw the truth of it written across his face. There was no escape from this world now. She was bound to him, to his darkness, to his protection. The only way out was through. "Together then," she whispered, and felt his grip tighten ever so slightly on her face, possessive, protective, promising. In the distance, sirens wailed. a reminder that danger still lurked. But for now, in this moment, Sophie accepted her fate. She was Vince's, and he was hers, bound together in a world of shadows and blood. The morning sun cast long shadows across Vince's office as Sophie watched him pace, his jaw clenched tight. The air felt heavy with tension as Alessandro stood before them, his usual confident smirk replaced by a look of barely concealed fear. "You really thought I wouldn't find out?" Vince's voice was deadly quiet. He moved with the grace of a predator, circling Alessandro. "That your little meetings with Giovanni would go unnoticed?" Sophie's stomach churned. She'd seen Alessandro around the mansion countless times, always with a friendly word and charming smile. He'd even helped her pick out art supplies last week. But now, watching him squirm under Vince's piercing gaze, she saw the truth, the calculating look in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly. "Boss, I can explain." Alessandro started, but Vince cut him off with a sharp gesture. "How long?" Vince demanded. "How long have you been selling us out to Giovanni?" Alessandro's face paled. "It's not what you think." The crack of Vince's fist connecting with Alessandro's jaw echoed through the room. Sophie flinched but didn't look away. She'd seen enough violence in recent weeks to know that this was just the beginning. What followed was brutal and efficient. Sophie watched as Vince systematically broke down the man who had betrayed him, each blow calculated to cause maximum pain. There was no pleasure in Vince's eyes, only cold determination. When it was over, Vince's men dragged Alessandro's unconscious form away. Sophie stood frozen, her heart pounding. She understood now why Vince's enemies feared him so completely. Vince turned to her, his knuckles bloody. For a moment, his mask slipped, and she saw the weight of what he'd done in his eyes. "I never wanted you to see this side of me," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "But this is who I am, Sophie. This is what I have to be." Sophie moved toward him, surprising herself with her steadiness. She took his bloodied hand in hers, examining the split skin across his knuckles. "I know," she whispered. "I understand now." Vince's free hand came up to cup her cheek, and she leaned into his touch. The tenderness of the gesture was a stark contrast to the violence she'd just witnessed, but somehow it made perfect sense. This was his world, brutality and tenderness, violence and love, all wrapped up together. "You're the only one who sees all of me," he murmured, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "The only one I trust to see it all." Sophie's heart fluttered at his words. She knew she should be running from this man, this world of violence and betrayal. But instead, she found herself drawing closer, accepting the darkness along with the light. They stood there in the quiet aftermath, his hand warm against her cheek, her fingers still holding his bloodied ones. No words were needed. They both understood what this moment meant. She was choosing to stay, choosing him, choosing all of it. The world outside was still full of dangers and enemies. But in that moment, they had found their own kind of peace in the chaos. The night was quiet, almost deceptively so. As Sophie walked into the private dining room, Vince had arranged everything perfectly. Soft candlelight, fine wine, and an intimate table setting that spoke of careful consideration. The room felt different from the rest of the mansion, warmer somehow, less imposing. Vince stood as she entered, his usual hard expression softening at the sight of her. "I thought we could use a break from everything," he said, pulling out her chair. Sophie sat down, noticing how his fingers lingered on the back of her chair. "It's beautiful," she admitted, taking in the elaborate setup. "But why?" "Because you deserve something normal," he replied, his voice low and gravelly. "Even if just for one night." As they shared the meal, Sophie watched Vince's walls slowly come down. The wine helped, but it was more than that. There was an openness to him she'd never seen before. "My father," he began, swirling the wine in his glass. He wasn't always in the family business. He was forced into it like I was. His green eyes met hers across the table. The betrayal that brought me here. It wasn't just about money or power. It was about family. Sophie leaned forward, drawn in by the raw emotion in his voice. What happened? My uncle, Vince said, his jaw tightening. He sold us out to a rival family. My father died protecting me. His knuckles went white around his glass. That's why I can't let anyone threaten what's mine. Not ever again. Sophie reached across the table, placing her hand over his. His skin was warm, and she felt him relax slightly at her touch. Is that why you're so protective of me? You're different, he admitted, turning his hand to hold hers properly. You make me want things I shouldn't. The candlelight flickered across his face, highlighting the vulnerability in his expression. Sophie felt her heart ache for him, this dangerous man who carried so much pain beneath his cold exterior. I understand now, she whispered, squeezing his hand. Why you are the way you are. Vince's thumb traced circles on her palm, sending shivers down her spine. This world, my world, it's dark, Sophie, but with you. He paused, struggling with the words. With you, there's light. The evening ended too soon, but something had shifted between them. As Sophie lay in bed that night, she realized that loving Vince wasn't a choice anymore. It was as inevitable as the sunrise. In his violent world, their love was the only thing that made sense, the only thing that felt real. She knew that tomorrow would bring more danger, more violence, more chaos. But for now, she held on to the memory of Vince's vulnerability, of his trust in her. In the darkness of his world, their love was beginning to feel like the only safe harbor either of them had ever known. The mansion felt different that night. Blood still stained the marble floors from the latest attack, and Sophie could smell gunpowder in the air. Her hands trembled as she made her way to Vince's study, her heart heavy with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. She found him standing by the window, his broad shoulders tense as he stared into the darkness. Even now, after everything, the sight of him made her breath catch, dangerous and beautiful, like a lethal work of art. How many more? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How many more people have to die before this ends? Vince turned slowly, his green eyes finding hers in the dim light. Blood speckled his white shirt, not his own, she knew. Never his own. As many as it takes, he said, his voice low and firm. This is my world, Sophie. Our world now. She wrapped her arms around herself, fighting back tears. I can't keep watching people die. I can't keep pretending this is normal. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his presence overwhelming her as always. His fingers traced her jaw, gentle despite the violence they'd dealt earlier. You think I want this for you? For us? His touch burned against her skin. But there's no other way. Giovanni won't stop until one of us is dead. Then leave, she pleaded. We could go somewhere else, start over. No. The word cut through the air like a blade. I don't run. Ever. His eyes softened as they met hers. This empire, everything I've built, it's who I am. I can't walk away any more than I can walk away from loving you. Sophie's heart clenched. This was the truth she'd been avoiding. The man she loved was forged in violence, shaped by power. There was no separating Vince from his world. He pulled her closer, his warmth seeping into her bones. You're mine now, Sophie, and I'll burn this whole city to the ground before I let anyone take you from me. She closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. She loved him. God help her. She loved this dangerous, broken man. But as gunfire echoed in the distance, she wondered if their love would be enough to survive the storm that was coming. The scene ends with Sophie caught between two impossible choices: the safety of her old life, or the dangerous love of a man who would kill to keep her safe. In her heart, she already knew which she would choose. She just wasn't sure she could live with the consequences. Sophie's heart thundered against her ribs as Vince backed her against the wall of his study. His massive frame caged her in, those piercing green eyes blazing with an intensity that made her breath catch. The leather and spice scent of him filled her senses, drowning out everything else. "You're mine," he growled, his voice rough with need. His fingers traced her jawline, gentle despite the possessive grip he maintained on her waist. "Say it!" Sophie's pulse jumped at the command. Even now, caught between desire and fear, she couldn't deny the pull he had on her. "Vince, His lips crashed into hers, cutting off her words. The kiss was desperate, hungry, filled with all the darkness and passion that defined their relationship. Sophie melted into him, her hands gripping his shoulders as he deepened the kiss. For a moment, she could forget about Giovanni's threats, about the violence that surrounded them, about the blood that stained Vince's hands. Here, in his arms, there was only this: the heat between them, the way his touch made her feel both safe and dangerous at once. Vince broke the kiss, pressing his forehead against hers. "I need to hear you say it, Sophie. I need to know you understand what you mean to me." The vulnerability in his voice made her heart ache. This was the side of him only she got to see, the man beneath the monster, the heart behind the violence. "I'm yours," she whispered. The words both a surrender and a truth. She couldn't fight anymore. Later, as they lay tangled in each other's arms, Vince's fingers traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "I'll burn this whole city down before I let anyone take you from me," he murmured against her hair. Sophie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words. His protection was both a blessing and a curse. The very thing that kept her alive could also be what destroyed them both. But as his arms tightened around her, she knew there was no going back. They were bound together now, for better or worse, in this dangerous world they called home. In the darkness of the room, she could almost believe his promises would be enough to keep them safe. But the reality of their situation lingered at the edges of her mind, a constant reminder that in their world, even love came with a price. The marble floors of Giovanni Salieri's office echoed with Sophie's footsteps as his men escorted her inside. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her chin high, refusing to show fear. Giovanni sat behind an imposing desk, his silver-streaked hair perfectly styled, his smile as sharp as a blade. "Miss Miller," he purred, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Please sit." Sophie remained standing, her fingers curled into fists at her sides. "What do you want?" Giovanni's smile widened, but it didn't reach his cold eyes. "Direct. I like that." He stood, circling his desk with predatory grace. "I have a proposition for you, my dear, one that could solve all our complications." "I'm not interested in anything you have to offer," Sophie said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Oh, but you haven't heard it yet." Giovanni stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne. "Leave Vincenzo. Join me instead. I can offer you protection, wealth, freedom, everything he's denied you." Sophie's stomach turned. "You mean betray him?" "I mean survive." Giovanni's voice hardened. "Vincenzo's empire is crumbling. When it falls, and it will fall, you don't want to be caught in the debris." "No." The word came out sharp and clear. Giovanni's pleasant mask slipped, revealing the monster beneath. "Then you'll share his fate. When I destroy him, and I will destroy him, you'll lose everything." Is he worth that sacrifice? Sophie met his gaze, steel in her spine. You don't understand him at all if you think threats will work. And you don't understand the game you're playing, little girl. Giovanni's fingers gripped her chin, forcing her to look at him. Love won't save you from what's coming. Sophie jerked away from his touch, disgust rolling through her. We're done here. Back at the mansion, Vince's rage was explosive when he learned of the meeting. He stormed through his office, his green eyes blazing. You never meet with him again, he snarled. Never. Sophie watched him pace, her heart heavy. He's not going to stop. Vince, I'll kill him first. Vince's voice was ice cold, promising violence. He stopped in front of her, cupping her face in his hands. No one threatens what's mine. No one. But as Sophie looked into his eyes, she saw the fear beneath his anger. This wasn't just about power or territory anymore. This was about them, about what they'd found in each other. And she feared that in this war between titans, their love might be the first casualty. The distant sound of gunfire pierced the night, and Sophie's heart stopped. She crouched behind Vince's massive mahogany desk, her fingers trembling as they gripped the edge. The mansion's security alarms blared, their sharp wails mixing with shouts and the heavy thud of boots on marble floors. Stay here, Vince ordered, his green eyes dark with barely contained rage. Don't move until I come back for you. Before Sophie could protest, he was gone, leaving her alone in his study. The sounds of chaos grew louder, and she pressed herself deeper into the shadows. Then the violence erupted. Through the study's heavy doors, Sophie heard it all. The brutal efficiency in Vince's commands, the desperate screams of Giovanni's men, the sickening crack of bones, and the wet sound of flesh meeting flesh. She covered her mouth with her hand, trying to muffle her own panicked breathing. When the doors burst open, she nearly screamed. But it was Vince who entered, his white shirt splattered with crimson, his knuckles raw and bleeding. His eyes found her immediately, and something in them softened just barely. They're dead, he said simply. All of them. Sophie stood on shaky legs, taking in the destruction written across his body. Vince, I told you before. His voice was hoarse, dangerous. Anyone who tries to take you from me dies. That's not negotiable. She approached him slowly, like one might a wounded animal. Her hand reached out, touching his bloodied cheek. Instead of flinching away, he leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for just a moment. This is what loving you means, he whispered. This darkness, this violence, I won't apologize for it. Sophie's heart ached as she looked at him, this dangerous, broken man who would tear the world apart to keep her safe. The violence terrified her, but his devotion, that terrified her even more. I know, she said softly. I know what you are now. Vince pulled her against him, not caring that his blood-stained clothes would ruin her dress. His arms were steel bands around her, protective and possessive all at once. You're mine, he breathed against her hair. And I'll kill anyone who tries to change that. Sophie closed her eyes, feeling the tremors running through his body, the aftermath of violence and adrenaline. She knew then that there was no going back. This was their world now, beautiful and terrible, tender and brutal. And somehow, despite everything, she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The mansion's great room stood silent, the aftermath of violence etched into every shadow. Blood stained the imported rugs, and bullet holes marred the elegant wallpaper. Sophie sat on the leather couch, her hands still trembling as she watched Vince's men clear away the evidence of the battle. Vince stood by the window, his broad shoulders tense as he spoke quietly into his phone. Even now, after the violence had ended, he remained vigilant. His white shirt was spattered with blood, his knuckles raw from the fight. But his eyes, when they met Sophie's across the room, held something else entirely, a tenderness that made her heart skip. "It's done," he said finally, ending the call. He crossed the room to her in long strides, his presence filling the space between them. "Giovanni's men won't be a problem anymore." Sophie drew in a shaky breath. "But he's still out there." "Yes." Vince knelt before her, taking her hands in his. His touch was gentle, a stark contrast to the brutality she'd witnessed earlier. "He won't stop until he's destroyed everything I care about." "Everything you care about?" Sophie repeated softly, searching his face. "Including me?" "Especially you." His grip tightened on her hands. "You're the only thing that matters now, Sophie. The only thing worth protecting." She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. The violence of his world still terrified her, but she couldn't deny the safety she felt in his presence. When she opened her eyes again, Vince was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I won't let him hurt you," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll burn this whole city down before I let that happen." Sophie reached out, her fingers trailing along his jaw. "I know you would. That's what scares me." Vince pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, breathing in his familiar scent of leather and gunpowder. His heart beat steady against her cheek, a reminder that they'd survived for now. "Whatever comes next," he whispered into her hair, "you're mine, Sophie. Nothing will change that." She pressed closer, knowing that this moment of peace was temporary. Giovanni was still out there, plotting his revenge. The war wasn't over, it was just beginning. But as Vince held her, his arms strong and sure around her, Sophie knew she'd made her choice. She belonged in this dangerous world now, with this dangerous man. And whatever storm was coming, they would face it together. The morning air felt heavy in Vince's study as Sophie watched him pace, his shoulders tense beneath his perfectly tailored suit. Papers were scattered across his mahogany desk, surveillance reports, phone records, and financial statements. But it was the small note in his hand that had transformed him into something darker, more dangerous than she'd ever seen. "Someone close to us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "has been feeding information to Giovanni." His green eyes, usually so controlled, blazed with a fury that made Sophie's breath catch. She took a step toward him, but froze when his gaze snapped to her. The raw pain beneath his anger made her heart ache. "Who?" she asked. "Someone I trusted." He crumpled the note in his fist. "Someone who's been with me for years." Sophie watched as he moved to the window, his reflection a study in contained violence. The betrayal seemed to physically pain him, and she understood why. In his world, trust was everything. Betrayal meant death. "Your men are loyal to you," she said softly. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they rang hollow. Vince turned, his laugh bitter and sharp. "Loyal? Money speaks louder than loyalty, Sophie. Giovanni's been buying my people right under my nose." He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, stopping inches from her. His presence overwhelmed her senses, cologne, leather, and that underlying darkness that both terrified and thrilled her. "I can't trust anyone," he said, his voice rough. "Not even my inner circle." Sophie reached up, touching his face gently. "You can trust me." His eyes softened for a moment, before hardening again. "Giovanni's planning something big. This betrayal, it's just the beginning." "What do you mean?" Vince caught her hand in his grip almost painful. "He's going to try to take everything from me. My territory, my business." His other hand cupped her face. "You." Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. "I won't let him." "You don't understand." Vince cut her off. He knows you're my weakness. He knows that hurting you would destroy me more completely than any other attack. The weight of his words settled over them like a shroud. Sophie could see the toll this was taking on him. The constant vigilance, the paranoia, the knowledge that someone close to him wanted him dead. "Then we fight," she whispered, pressing closer to him. Together. Vince's arms wrapped around her, crushing her against his chest. His heartbeat was strong and steady against her cheek, but she could feel the tension coursing through him. "I won't lose you," he said into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll kill every last person who tries to take you from me." Sophie closed her eyes, knowing his words weren't just a promise, they were a death sentence for anyone who stood in their way. The violence of his world should have repulsed her, but instead she found herself clinging to him tighter, accepting the darkness that came with loving him. "Giovanni's coming," Vince whispered, his words carrying the weight of certainty. "And when he does, blood will flow." Sophie pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, seeing the storm brewing there. She knew then that their love had become a weapon, one that could either save them or destroy them completely. The mansion felt like a tomb. Sophie walked through its empty halls, the usual bustle of Vince's men replaced by an eerie silence. Everything was falling apart, crumbling like a house of cards, and she could feel it in her bones. She found Vince in his study, hunched over his desk with a glass of whiskey in hand. Papers were scattered everywhere, some crumpled, others torn. The mighty mafia boss looked broken, defeated in a way she'd never seen before. "Get out!" he growled without looking up. His voice was rough, like he hadn't slept in days. Sophie's heart ached, but she stood her ground. No. His head snapped up, green eyes blazing with fury. "I said get out!" He hurled the glass against the wall, making her jump. The smell of whiskey filled the air as amber liquid dripped down the expensive wallpaper. "You don't get to push me away," Sophie said, her voice trembling but determined. "Not now, not after everything." Vince rose from his chair, his movements predatory. "You don't understand what's happening. Giovanni is closing in. My own men," his voice cracked. "I can't trust anyone." "You can trust me." Sophie stepped closer, even as he backed away. "I'm not leaving you, Vince. Not when you're like this." "Like what?" He sneered, but she could see the pain behind his anger. "A failure? A boss who can't even keep his own house in order? Stop it." Sophie closed the distance between them, reaching for his face. He tried to turn away, but she wouldn't let him. "You're not a failure. You're the strongest man I know." His laugh was bitter. "Strong? I couldn't even protect you from Giovanni. I couldn't stop the betrayal in my own ranks." "Then we'll face it together." Sophie's fingers traced his jaw, feeling the tension there. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Something in Vince's expression cracked. The mask of fury fell away, leaving raw vulnerability in its wake. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as they found her waist. "Sophie," his voice was barely a whisper. "I can't lose you. If anything happened to you." She pressed her forehead against his chest, feeling his rapid heartbeat. "You won't lose me. I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere." Slowly, like ice melting in spring, Vince's rigid posture softened. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer until there wasn't any space left between them. She felt his breath hitch, a small sound that spoke volumes about his pain. "Let me help you," Sophie whispered against his shirt. "Please, Vince, don't shut me out." For a long moment, he was silent. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. The mighty mafia boss, the man who'd built his empire on fear and blood, finally allowed himself to lean on someone else. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by the evidence of his rage, they held each other. The war wasn't over. Giovanni was still out there, plotting their destruction. But for now, in this moment, they had each other. And sometimes, Sophie thought, that was enough to keep the darkness at bay. Vince found Sophie in his study, where the warm glow of desk lamps created islands of light in the darkness. His footsteps were silent as he approached her, but she sensed his presence anyway. She always did. Sophie. His voice was low, controlled, but she heard the strain beneath it. "We need to talk." She turned to face him, her heart catching at the sight of him. Even now, with his empire crumbling around him, he carried himself with that lethal grace that had first drawn her to him. But there was something different in his eyes tonight. Something raw and exposed. "Giovanni's men are closing in," he said, moving closer. "By tomorrow, everything could change." Sophie's breath hitched as he reached for her hand. His touch was gentle, so at odds with the violence she knew those hands were capable of. "After everything," his voice roughened, "all the blood I've spilled, all the lives I've taken, do you know what I've realized?" He pulled her closer, his green eyes boring into hers. "You're the only thing worth fighting for. The only thing I've ever truly wanted." Tears pricked at Sophie's eyes. This was Vince stripped bare, no masks, no walls, just the truth of what she meant to him. "I'm a monster," he continued, his thumb tracing her cheek. "I've done things that would make you run if you knew. But with you," he swallowed hard, "with you, I want to be more than that." Sophie reached up, pressing her palm against his chest, feeling his heart thundering beneath her touch. All the fear, all the doubt that had plagued her since entering his world melted away in that moment. Their lips met in a desperate clash of need and emotion. Vince's arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him like she was his last lifeline in a storm. The kiss deepened, speaking of all the things they couldn't say, the fear, the love, the desperate hope for tomorrow. When they finally broke apart, Vince pressed his forehead to hers. "No matter what happens," he whispered, his voice fierce with promise, "I'll protect you, even if it costs me everything." Sophie curled her fingers into his shirt, holding him close. In that moment, she knew whatever came next, whatever price they had to pay, this man was worth it all. The mansion erupted into chaos as Giovanni's men stormed the gates. Gunfire shattered the night air, and Sophie pressed herself against the wall of the safe room, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the security monitors, she watched Vince move with lethal precision, his movements calculated and deadly. Blood sprayed across marble floors as Vince's men engaged the intruders. But it was Vince himself who commanded attention, a dark angel of death, dealing punishment with cold efficiency. His green eyes blazed with fury as he cut through Giovanni's forces, each movement bringing him closer to his rival. "You should have stayed away from what's mine." Vince's voice carried through the chaos, directed at Giovanni, who stood at the center of his men. Giovanni sneered, "Your weakness for the girl will be your downfall, Vincenzo." The words had barely left Giovanni's mouth when Vince struck. The fight between the two bosses was brutal, a dance of violence that made Sophie's stomach turn. But she couldn't look away, especially when Vince took a hit that sent him staggering. Blood dripped from a cut above Vince's eye, but he didn't slow down. If anything, the injury only fueled his rage. He moved like a force of nature, unstoppable and merciless. When his fist connected with Giovanni's jaw, the crack echoed through the room. The battle seemed to last forever. But finally, Giovanni fell. His men, seeing their leader defeated, scattered like rats from a sinking ship. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie burst from the safe room, ignoring the warnings of Vince's men. She ran to him, her heart in her throat, as she saw the extent of his injuries. Blood stained his white shirt, and bruises were already forming on his face. "Vince," she whispered, reaching for him. He caught her hand, his grip gentle, despite the violence he'd just delivered. "It's over," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "He'll never threaten you again." Sophie pressed her forehead against his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady, just like him. Around them, men cleared the bodies and tended to the wounded. But in that moment, it was just them. They had survived the storm, emerged from the darkness together. The war was over, but as Sophie held on to Vince, she knew this was just the beginning of their story. The monster she'd feared had become her protector, her lover, her everything. And despite the blood and violence that surrounded them, she wouldn't have it any other way. Following the brutal climax, silence descended over the wreckage of what had once been Giovanni's compound. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood. Sophie picked her way carefully through the debris, her heart pounding as she made her way to where Vince stood, his broad shoulders tense beneath his torn suit jacket. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, but his piercing green gaze remained sharp as ever. When he turned to look at her, the ruthless mask he usually wore had bloodless, cracked, revealing the exhaustion and vulnerability underneath. For the first time since she'd known him, Vince looked truly human. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice rough. "Giovanni's dead." Sophie nodded, unable to find words as she took in the destruction around them. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, a testament to the violence that had brought them to this moment. Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to stay steady. "Was it worth it?" she whispered, not entirely sure she wanted to know the answer. Vince's expression softened as he reached for her, his calloused hand gentle against her cheek. "You're safe now," he said simply. "That's all that matters." Sophie leaned into his touch, feeling the tremors that ran through his body. Exhaustion, pain, or perhaps something deeper. They stood there in silence, surrounded by the aftermath of war, both understanding that nothing would ever be the same. Finally, Vince pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with desperate intensity. "I know I'm not a good man," he murmured against her hair. "But I swear to you, Sophie, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to give you the future you deserve. Whatever it takes." Sophie pressed her face into his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She knew their world would never be completely safe or normal, but maybe, just maybe, they could find their own version of peace. In the end, that was all she could hope for. "I know," she whispered back. "We'll figure it out together." As the sun began to set over the carnage, they held each other, two broken people who had somehow found wholeness in their shared darkness. The war was over, but their story was just beginning. Weeks after the final battle, Sophie stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of Vince's mansion. No, their mansion now. The setting sun painted the manicured grounds in shades of gold and crimson, reminding her of that first terrifying night when he'd brought her here. Everything had changed since then. Behind her, Vince's heavy footsteps approached, deliberately loud enough to announce his presence. He'd learned to do that after realizing how his silent movements used to startle her. It was one of countless small ways he'd adapted for her, even as she'd learned to accept his world. "You're thinking too hard again," he said, his deep voice sending a familiar shiver down her spine. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. Sophie leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of him. "Just remembering how scared I was of you in the beginning." His chest rumbled with a low laugh. "You were never as scared as you should have been." His lips brushed her ear. "That's what fascinated me about you." She turned in his arms, studying his face. The dangerous edge was still there. It would always be there. But his green eyes had softened when they looked at her. The coldness that had first terrified her now melted whenever she was near. "Your empire is stronger than ever," she said, running her fingers along his jaw. "And this time it's built on something more than fear." Vince caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Everything I have, everything I am, belongs to you now." His voice dropped lower, possessive and tender all at once. "You're mine, forever. No one can take you from me." Sophie smiled, her heart full of the love that had somehow bloomed in this dangerous world. "I wouldn't let them try." He pulled her closer, and she felt the steady beat of his heart against her chest. They'd carved out their own peace in this violent world, finding strength in each other that neither had known they possessed. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. In the growing darkness, Sophie felt completely safe in the arms of the man who had once terrified her. Their love hadn't erased the darkness of their world. It had simply given them the strength to face it together. Vince's thumb traced her lower lip, his touch gentle despite the calluses earned from years of violence. "You changed everything," he whispered, voice rough with emotion. "You made me want to be better, to build something worthy of you." Sophie stretched up on her toes, pressing her lips to his in a soft kiss. "We built it together," she corrected him, "and we'll keep building it, whatever comes next." As night settled over their domain, Sophie and Vince remained wrapped in each other's arms, their silhouettes merging into one shadow against the darkened windows. They had survived betrayal, violence, and war, emerging stronger for it. Their love, forged in darkness and tempered by fire, would endure whatever challenges lay ahead. In the end, the monster and his captive had become something else, entirely partners, equals, and above all, survivors who had found redemption in each other's arms. If you enjoyed the story of Vincenzo, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.